האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, good evening. We're in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Va'era. We are going to do section Tesvav, section 15. Before we begin this week's piece, let's take a look at a pasuk from the Parsha. This is Parshas Va'era, Perek Tes, pasuk Yud Tes. And it's a pasuk from the psukim that deal with the plague of Borod, the seventh plague of hail. Ve'ata shalach ha'ez es miknecha. Moshe Rabbeinu said to Paro, and now send to gather in your flocks ve'es kol asher lecha basadeh, and everything you have that's out in the fields. Kol ha'adam v'habehemo asher yimotzei vasadeh. All of the people and all of the animals that would be found in the fields, v'lo ye'asef habaisa, and they are not collected into the house, v'yorad alehem haborod, and the hail will come upon them, v'mesu, and they will die. So Moshe lets Paro know that it's extremely important for any people and any animals to come inside before the plague of Borod, of hail, begins, and this they'll be able to survive if they do that. But if they stay outside, they're going to die. So let's see what the Zera Shimshon has in store for us. Os Tes Vav, section 15. Pasuk, the pasuk says, this is the pasuk we just looked at, Ve'ata shalach ha'ez es miknecha, and now send and gather in your flocks, v'chuli, etc. Hikshu hamaforshim, the commentators asked, Loma lo hizhir Moshe b'makas hadever. Why didn't Moshe give a similar warning with the plague of pestilence, of animal disease, which was the fifth plague, to Moshe hizhir b'chan b'makas haborad, like he just gave the warning we just read about regarding the plague of hail? Lomar lahem, to say to them, Ve'ata shalach ha'ez es miknecha, and now send and gather in your animals, right? Very straightforward question. During the plague of, right before the plague of Borod, of hail, Hashem is kind enough to tell Moshe, or seemingly, apparently kind enough, we don't know the motivation yet, but Moshe tells Paro, tell everyone to bring in their animals, to bring in the people, bring in the animals, and therefore they won't die during the plague of hail. However, during the two plagues previously, during the plague that also struck the animals of dever, of pestilence, Moshe did not say that. Ulefi mash, next paragraph. Ulefi mash perish Rashi al pasuk vayehi shechin v'chule ba'adam uvabehema. According to what Rashi explained on the pasuk during the plague, the sixth plague of boils, where it talked about the boils affecting people and animals, Rashi said, Ve'im tomar, and if you say, meaning if you ask a question, me ayin hoyu lahem behemos, from where could they have had any animals to be affected by the boils, by the shchin? V'halok far ne'amar, didn't the Torah already state, Vayomas kol miknei Mitzrayim, and all of the animals of Mitzrayim died during the plague of pestilence? So Rashi says, if you ask the question, which seems to be a pretty good question, how could there be any animals to be struck with boils when didn't they all die during the plague of pestilence? V'teretz, and Rashi answered, Lo nigzera gezera ella al osam shebosados, top of the next column. The decree of pestilence only applied to animals that were outdoors. And people who fear the word of Hashem, meaning Egyptians who feared Hashem, brought in their animals to the houses. They didn't leave their animals outside during the plague of pestilence, and therefore their animals were spared. And so those animals could have been struck with boils. Im Kain, according to that explanation of Rashi, lo hoyet tzorich lehazhir afilu baborod, Moshe seemingly should not have needed to give a warning during the plague of Borod, of hail, me'achar shero'a shekfar osu me'atzmon badever, after it became clear that the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, brought in their animals on their own, during the plague of pestilence. So Rashi's Zera Shimshon is asking a question, and he's saying the question can be posed in two different ways. The first way he posed the question was, how come Moshe gave a warning to bring in the animals for the plague of Barad of hail, but not previously for the plague of pestilence of Dever? Then he said, you could look at it a different way and say, since the Egyptians brought in their animals on their own initiative during the plague of pestilence, and Moshe didn't need to say anything, tell them to do that, why did he give a warning during the plague of Barad, the plague of hail? Why didn't he just let them bring in the animals on their own, which apparently they would have done? However you slice it, the question is simply this: why did Moshe treat the plague of Barad differently than the plague of Dever? And the way he did do it differently is he didn't give any warning about bringing the animals inside regarding the plague of Dever, of pestilence, but he did do so for the plague of Barad, of hail. And he is going to give us, the Zera Shimshon is going to give us 4 possible answers to this question. And he begins in the next paragraph. V'yuvan, and this can be understood b'masha kosav hazohar, with something that is written in the Zohar. Dever uvorad inun asvan mamash. Dever, pestilence, uvorad, and hail, they have the same letters exactly, the same letters. The Dalid, the Vez, and the Resh of Dever are the same letters that make up the word Borad, Vez, Resh, Dalid. The Dever ahad Borad. And the letters in the plague of Dever can be turned around to equal the letters in the plague of Barad, of hail. Ma bein hai lahai. So the Zohar asks, so if they have the same letters, what's the difference between this one and this one? Elado bidnichusa. But the difference is that this one is done gently, and that's a reference to the plague of pestilence. V'da b'sikufa dirugza. And this one, the hail, comes with force and anger. Ad kan lashono, until here is a quote from the Zohar. So the Zohar teaches us that there's a close relationship, an exact relationship in terms of the letters of the words of Dever and Barad. This indicates a relationship between the two makos, the two plagues. However, there's a very important difference, and that is that pestilence came with a certain gentleness. It brought an immediate death to animals, as opposed to Barad, which brought pain and suffering because it came with force and anger. Continuing, bottom of the line. Ve'af anu nomar. So even we can say, shebishlama b'makas hadever. It makes sense regarding the plague of pestilence. Continuing to the next page. Choshvu hamitzrim. The Egyptians thought lihimolet min hamaka, that they could successfully get their animals to survive this plague. Im hayu machnisim hamikne labatim. If they simply brought the animals into the houses. Lefisha hayu yodim, because they knew shelo hayu called kach din virogas, because they knew that the plague of Dever was going to kill animals without the judgment and force and anger of the plague of Barad. Umishum hachi hichnisam, and that's why they brought the animals in, thinking this is not such a terrible plague. Our animals can survive as long as we bring the animals inside. Aval Barad, but regarding the plague of hail, which they knew was going to come with anger and judgment from Hashem. Perhaps some people wouldn't bring in their animals because they would think they might think there's no way to escape the anger from Hashem, but even by bringing the animals inside. So according to that, let's continue in the next paragraph. Because of this distinction, his hero Moshe had to warn them, Shalach ha'ez, or had to warn Paro, and he warned his people, go and send and bring in your animals, she'im yachnisum yunimlotim, because if you bring them in, they will escape, they will survive. K'moshe kosvu hamaforshim, as the commentators write, in fact, Hashem wanted the animals to survive. As the commentators write, Hashem wanted there to be enough animals for the Egyptians to use them to pursue Bnei Yisrael when they went to the Yam Suf. So it was part of Hashem's plan, part and parcel of Hashem's plan for some animals to survive. And so in the plague of Dever, according to this first approach, the Egyptians themselves figured out they could bring the animals inside to save them. But in the plague of Barad, where they would not know that, they didn't do so, and Moshe had to warn them. Now begins the second answer. Inami, alternatively, Haida Omar Lo Moshe Shalach Ha'ez, this that Moshe said, send and bring in the animals, Lo Hayilarachem Alehem. This was not actually to take compassion on the Egyptians and or their animals, Ela Adarabba, but rather it was just the opposite. L'ro'osam, it was for their evil. This was to their detriment. As we just stated a moment ago, in order for the Egyptians to have animals to bring them to the sea where they would meet their doom. If they didn't have enough animals, perhaps they would not travel and chase after Bnei Yisrael when they went towards the Yamsuf. And this was part of the force and anger that came with the plague of Barad, which was Hashem's anger to make sure to leave the Egyptians' animals so they could ultimately all be wiped out. But when it came to the plague of pestilence, which was, as we've stated, as we saw in the Zohar, which came with a certain gentleness, Lo amar lohem shlacha ezes miknecha. Moshe didn't say the words because at that point Hashem wasn't thinking, let me preserve these animals so I can wipe out the Egyptians. That was not Hashem's mindset, specifically during the plague of Dever. Continuing to the top of the next column. The od b'derech acher, and we can also offer another approach. The Isa b'medrash Yalkut, because it states in the Medrash Yalkut Shimoni, Dever mipnei ma bo alehem. Pestilence, why did it come upon them? Lefi shesh samu es Yisrael roe behemos shelahem. Because the Egyptians forced Bnei Yisrael to be the shepherds of their animals. Lefichach hevi alehem dever. Therefore, Hashem brought upon the Egyptians as a punishment, a midah keneged midah, the punishment of pestilence. V'harag kol ma she'ra'u Yisrael. And this plague killed all the animals that the Jews were forced to shepherd. Barad mipnei ma hevi alehem. And the Yalkut Shimoni continues, why did Hashem bring upon them the plague of hail? Lefisha samu es Yisrael note ginos upardesem. Because the Mitzrayim forced the Jews to be their gardeners and their orchard watchmen, or orchard planters, their landscapers. Leficha hevi alehem bara. Therefore, Hashem brought on them the plague of hail, midah keneged midah, measure for measure. V'shiber kol ma shenatu Yisrael, and that plague destroyed all of the things, the plants that the Jews planted. V'im kain, and if so, dafka b'makas haborad. According to that explanation of the Yalkut Shimoni, it was specifically during the plague, for the plague of hail, which only was directed at the plants. Amar lo shlacha ez. Moshe said, send and bring in the animals. Kedesha yakiru hetev tam hamaka. In order for the Egyptians to clearly understand the reason for the plague, that it was to strike the plants and gardens and orchards that they had forced the Jews to prepare for them. But regarding the plague of pestilence, that just the opposite, the intention of the plague itself was to kill the animals that the Jews had been forced to shepherd. It would not have made sense for Moshe to say to Paro, send and bring in the animals. The point was for that plague to kill the animals. The ode and one final fourth approach, it's connected to the third approach, but additional aspect is added here. If Moshe had said to Paro in the plague of pestilence to bring in the animals, and Paro and his servants would have listened and brought in their flocks to the houses, if so, the plague wouldn't have been accomplished anything. But regarding the plague of hail, Afim hayu shomim lo, even if the people all listened and brought in all their animals, im kol zeh hamaka hisay mishaberes hanetios, nonetheless, the plague would have broken the plants that Bnei Yisrael had been forced to plant and to maintain and to take care of. Yasher koach to everyone for joining the learning today and understanding the plagues of Barad, Dever and Barad in a deeper way, according to the approaches of the Zera Shimshon. And we look forward again, God willing, to learning in the Zera Shimshon again next week.